Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian, who forgot Russia and China as well, show on Pod TV. And my name is Sasha Star, and I have a wonderful guest today. It's Professor Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan. I guess there are some technical issue. However, while we are waiting for Jonathan Lockwood to appear, I would like to mention that there is something interesting happened in the last probably few days, maybe even more than a week. There are some noises, especially initiated by French President Emmanuel Macron, that French armed forces could join Ukraine in a fight against Russia. The other NATO countries like US, Germany, and others, they said that, oh no, that's impossible. It's not going to happen. However, Macron did not retract his statement. So another thing is that I think as late as yesterday, there is some kind of information, or you can qualify it as a noise just as well, because it's difficult to verify and justify this information. But that's something about Ukraine to join NATO. Okay, these two pieces of information, you can qualify them as the propaganda efforts to counter Russian propaganda, which is talking about starting the all-outright war against European NATO members, to throw nuclear devices over London and France and in Cosmos and just anywhere else. Obviously, it's a noise. Russia is not going to do it, number one. There's no benefit for Russia to do it because it will be destroyed in the next 10 to 15 minutes, including Putin himself, which it's not desirable outcome for him at all. He loves life, he loves luxury, and to die, what for? And and I don't think that Moscow is one of the best places to withstand nuclear attack. There was a very interesting article talking about U.S., best places in U.S. to be during the nuclear attack against the U.S. And by the way, our friends in North Carolina, they're doing quite well because North Carolina is one of the best places in the United States to withstand the nuclear attack. Of course, there are some other places like Rocky Mountains and so on. Jonathan, what do you think about it?
Well, all of this reminds me about, basically the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was living in St. Petersburg, Florida, which was right next to Tampa, Florida, which was right next to MacDill Air Force Base, a strategic 90 miles from Cuba. And within prime target range for the medium-range nuclear missiles, which Khrushchev had placed in Cuba. And I remember that my parents, during that period, the latter part of October, during the part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they sent me and my brother into the middle of the state of Florida, well away from the prime target, while my parents stayed behind. And that was a rather exciting. I knew in a vague sense what was going on, but of course, being the age I was at the time, did not have full awareness of all of the intricacies of it. Only in retrospect, when I studied the history of it and began examining the Russian perceptions of why they would do such a thing. Of course, Khrushchev wanted to do it because he thought that placing nuclear missiles forward in Cuba would be the equivalent of the U.S. with having its nuclear missiles in Turkey, forward basing of nuclear missiles, and that Khrushchev was trying to achieve trying to raise the value of his nuclear missile force on the cheap by simply positioning them forward in Cuba. Rational calculation, but he miscalculated the potential reaction of Kennedy. He underestimated Kennedy's reaction. So in any case, targeting, all this talk about targeting various cities and the French calculation, the French having a tendency to act independently anyway, especially with their development of the force de frappe, their nuclear missile force. It reminds me of what my professors once said. The French are essentially practicing finite deterrence. The French with their, I remember him remarking in class, the French with their force de frappe could threaten to destroy about 10 Soviet cities. The Soviets, on the other hand, could threaten to turn France into a parking lot, in which case the French lose interest in being a nuclear power. So all of this is it's very interesting abstract talk, but it's a lot of posturing on Russia's part. Because if we previously discussed, I believe that we've noticed that I've remarked that Russia has been tending to devote a lot fewer resources to maintaining and keeping their nuclear forces upgraded and in perfect operating condition. So although we do not know precisely, we know that Russia devotes a lot less resources to the maintenance and upkeep of their nuclear forces. We in the U.S. know how much in the way of resources are necessary in order to keep our nuclear forces in perfect optimal operating condition. So there's a certain amount of credibility to thinking that the Russians, in part, may be running a bluff, because their nuclear forces may not be nearly as effective. Because if they were forced to use their nuclear forces, it would quickly become apparent just how much of their nuclear force is really operational.
Jonathan, I think there is a rationale behind what Khrushchev did during the Cuban crisis, because you know that the missiles, in order to be fired, it requires a lot of fuel, and especially carry it from Russia all the way to the United States. However, if you do it from Cuba, it requires much less fuel. So this is a brilliant economic decision to bring your missile from Cuba instead of Russia.
Right, he got it. He would have gotten a double benefit because, logistically, and also it would cost a lot fewer resources for Russia to have to develop a larger intercontinental ballistic missile force, which it eventually had to do. But as a result, if he had been able to pull it off in Cuba and keep those missiles in Cuba, he would have achieved strategic nuclear parity with the United States in 1962 rather than 1969, because that's when eventually they caught up. So yes, it was shall we say, a strategic. It's amazing. Khrushchev was quite the gambler. He engaged in strategic bluffing when the Soviets first developed the ICBM in 1957. He was trying to give the West the impression that the Soviet Union was turning out ICBMs like sausages in their factories, and that the Soviet Union would continue to develop many more ICBMs unless the U.S. and the West were more forthcoming and accommodating in their foreign policy. And it was because of the U-2 overflights that we had been practicing over the Soviet Union that we eventually found out that by 1960, the Soviets really had six, and they were all above ground, not in silos. Our bomber force could have taken them out.
Absolutely.
So
Jonathan, it's very interesting is that, yes, they turned up a lot of missiles, according to them, but even six is okay. At that time, they had no sausages. People could not buy sausages in the stores. So when you say they're turning them as the sausages,
yeah,
where are the real sausages?
exactly. They were actually being truthful because apparently they weren't even turning out ICBMs like sausages because they couldn't turn out sausages. Well, okay, fine. Yeah, we should have been able to read between the lines, but actually the U-2 overflights did the job for us.
So speaking about fuel economy, so if you notice about all those noises, especially by Medvedev, sometimes even Putin himself or so on, so they don't threaten to attack New York or Washington or cities in the United States because maybe it takes too much fuel to get there. But they're talking about London, Paris, Berlin, and some other European capitals. So that requires less fuel. So it's more economical. So
Yeah,
now Ukraine is even more economical because it's right next to Russia. But what the best economy could be achieved is to annihilate their own cities because you require almost no fuel.
exactly.
And with
Yeah,
what's happening now there, I think it could happen.
yeah. The interesting also to add to that, I had mentioned in a previous program about when the West Germans went into East Germany and they went into their bases, the Warsaw Pact bases in East Germany, and they uncovered the Warsaw Pact's war plans for war against NATO. And Lothar Ruhl, a West German journalist, had written in an article in 1990 talking about what was in those war plans, and that essentially the Warsaw Pact had war plans to launch up to 300 nuclear strikes against NATO essentially in West Germany against the main NATO forces in West Germany. The basic concept being blast a hole in NATO's lines and then drive through to the Channel coast. And that was pretty good. That would have been pretty credible and logistically the most sustainable when you think about it, because that would have been the shortest distance. The Warsaw Pact would have had enough logistics in place to support a drive to the Channel coast following a massive nuclear strike.
And you remember how many tanks they possessed at that time, the Warsaw Pact. There's thousands and thousands of tanks.
Yeah. Under that scenario, a Warsaw Pact invasion of NATO would have been most credible. Now, when you look at the situation, the NATO has greatly expanded to the east. It has absorbed most, if not all, of the former Warsaw Pact nations, and even if the
all
Russians,
Scandinavian countries are all members of NATO.
yeah. So now NATO has much greater strategic depth and operational depth to the alliance than it did before, than it did at the height of the Cold War. And so now for the Russians, given Russia's demonstrated difficulties in sustaining any kind of logistical effort, sustained logistical effort for its armed forces, even if they did go nuclear, it's quite highly questionable as to whether they would be able to sustain any kind of operational drive through whatever holes they blasted. And of course, they have no strategic operation. They have no strategic defense that would enable them to block NATO's inevitable counterstrike from U.S. and NATO. And the U.S. and NATO's nuclear forces do, in fact, when all combined, outnumber those of Russia. Russia is not a nuclear force, although it is technically larger than the U.S. nuclear force. It's not nuclear. It's not greater than all the other nuclear forces against Russia combined.
And Jonathan, I think you're right when you're saying that to build more and more missiles to wage nuclear attack, it doesn't.
It's counterproductive.
It's already more than enough, but to defend against this threat,
yes, exactly. Exactly. That is why I have been stating all along that the most cost effective, and from a standpoint, if you look at it from a standpoint of a chess player, you do not copy your opponent's moves. You look for an asymmetric response. I could think that something which strikes at his weakness or that neutralizes some strength of your opponent. So in this case, if you're confronted with, the United States as a nuclear power is confronted with several rival nuclear powers, smaller in strength, the answer is not build more nuclear weapons. The proper answer, for both the U.S. and NATO, is to combine to create a global ballistic missile defense system that is capable of neutralizing the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, etc. And by doing that, you strike directly at the basis of all of those powers considering themselves great powers by virtue of their having nuclear weapons. Neutralize those nuclear weapons, and you create the basis for true strategic stability. And that is why whenever the United States mentions the possibility of strengthening its ballistic missile defenses or deploying ballistic missile defenses to certain areas, you hear the Russians screaming bloody murder about how destabilizing this would be. Well, yes, it would be destabilizing. It would be destabilizing to the Russians' ability to use their nuclear forces as leverage or as a means of great power status. Because anything that affects their nuclear forces necessarily weakens or negates their great power status.
Yes, Jonathan, I agree with you that it's the idea of using nuclear forces is highly questionable, and in the case of Russia, I think it's counterproductive because it will be hit with incredible force, and there is no benefit to Russia at all to use it. So probably if NATO forces would be 25 kilometers away from Moscow, maybe that's the only scenario where they should probably use the force, or even that will not bring them a lot of benefits. What an interesting thing happening right now is that Ukrainians are hitting more and more Russian-based military objects, and they're getting very, very good about it. They're drone attacks, and they're aiming at the airports, the military airports primarily, and the fuel tanks, and
they are exacerbating Russia's weaknesses in fuel production, oil production, and being able to sustain any kind of a long-term offensive against Ukraine. And oh, by the way, I'm rather skeptical of the recent reports where they say, well, where the Ukrainians are saying, well, the F-16s have arrived too late; they're no longer relevant. I think the Ukrainians are deliberately poor-mouthing themselves just to sort of de-emphasize. Those F-16s are, in fact, making and are going to make a significant difference, particularly if the Ukrainians manage to achieve local air superiority over Crimea and sever the logistical link between Russia and Crimea, sever the bridge, destroy it.
Jonathan, do you have any idea why Ukraine is getting F-16s and Israel is getting F-15s? What's the difference between these aircrafts? If you have any idea.
Not the fine points of differences between F-15s and F-16s. I would have to confer with my Air Force colleagues on that one.
I'm just curious.
But the fact of the matter is that the Ukrainians are acquiring qualitatively superior weapon systems in several areas. The Ukrainians have successfully exploited and integrated these weapon systems into their forces, and despite the right now the temporary ammunition shortages that Ukraine is experiencing, because they are on the strategic defensive, they have been able to compensate with fortifications and defenses in depth. They've been able to frustrate the Russian offensives. And the Russians appear to be making the same mistakes in their offensive operations that they did at the start of the war. Very wasteful use of their manpower and tanks. And as the Ukrainians successfully integrate the aid that they do get into their defense, I still maintain that within the next couple of months, the Ukrainians will be capable of launching a decisive counterstroke that would negate, if not reverse, for example, the Russian occupation of Crimea. I contend once that occurs, the game has changed more or less permanently, because then the Ukrainians will be able to consolidate, be able to gain air superiority over the theater, and permanently frustrate any Russian attempts to achieve their stated goals in Ukraine. And as the other NATO members consolidate and deliver on their promised aid to Ukraine, it will become well nigh impossible for the Russians to achieve any decisive results, and they will be, as Churchill said, nothing the Russians respect more than strength,
Yep.
and nothing they have more contempt for than weakness, particularly military weakness. And as you go ahead, yes.
John, I want to ask you that with the success of Ukraine hitting Russian-based military objects, I remember that for a long time, the present U.S. administration, they were against Ukrainians hitting Russian-based objects. It was particularly forbidden, and again, I don't know whether I can prove it or not, but I've read materials more than once that when Burns visited Moscow before the Russian invasion, there was agreement on certain rules, and one of them was that Ukraine will not be able to hit Russian-based objects. That's why maybe the only reason why the present administration, is so much against it. However, they're not supplying weapons, at least at the moment.
Right. So therefore, they were operating on the assumption that they were going to be able to get. They were operating on the assumption that we're going to be able to get this aid to you quickly. Therefore, there is no need for you to at that point to strike deep into Russia. However, once the U.S. As the checks and balances system began, which I said, it's operating the way the founding fathers intended it to operate. It is intended that the U.S. not be able to act swiftly in any circumstances. That's part of the price you pay for having a checks and balances constitutional republic. So therefore, because they realized, the U.S. leadership realized that they could not provide the promised aid as quickly as they thought they would be able to do, they instead said, okay, you can take the gloves off, you can strike deep against the Russians, because until we get this additional aid, we really don't want you falling to the Russians simply because we couldn't get the aid to you fast enough.
Jonathan, I think that founding fathers could not see the war between Ukraine and Russia. Remember, a couple of 100 years ago.
No, they could not have seen it at that point. Their principal concern in the checks and balances system and the others was to prevent the U.S. from too easily getting involved in foreign wars, and the checks and balances system is still vigorously in operation, as the coming election will have a decisive effect on how extensively the U.S. gets involved in future wars. And right now, it's a very interesting contest. But right now, Ukraine is acquitting itself very well. There is no question that the Ukrainians have been very clever in their strategy, very astute in their political observations and their diplomatic maneuvering. And what they are doing is they are making the absolute optimum use of the resources available to them to both frustrate the Russian advance and to set the stage for a decisive operational counterstroke. That's where the focus has to be right now.
Jonathan, I'm following a lot of Russian and Ukrainian-based publications, and lately I've noticed, especially Ukrainian publications, a little bit more noise about Crimea, because even a month ago I haven't seen even a word about Crimea.
You notice people are starting to wake up to the possibilities of Crimea, to Crimea becoming, in effect, the actual center of gravity of this entire conflict.
You're absolutely right. And that's what I've noticed in the last few days. It's now becoming much more discussed theme, and
especially with the recent successful attacks on the Kerch Bridge. its operational, its capability for getting supplies across. The supplies to Crimea have in fact been greatly reduced. That is, they are on the verge of being able to sever. Once that link is actually severed, then the opportunity arises for Ukraine to commit its strategic reserves for an offensive into Crimea itself. Once the Russian forces there are isolated, they will not be able to effectively resist.
Oh, they will have to resign, and very quickly, because there will be no electricity, no water. There are no supplies to Crimea unless it's coming from
And they certainly can't evacuate by sea. The Ukrainians have made sure of that. The Russian Black Sea Fleet is not going to come to their rescue and pull them off the beaches of the Crimean Peninsula in a Dunkirk style evacuation. There's going to be no such escape for them.
It will be a scenario: rescue the rescuers.
Mm-hmm.
That will be a very tragic initiative, if that's what Russians have in mind. Jonathan, I would like to thank you very much for today's program. I think we've covered a lot of grounds today, and looking forward to see you on Tuesday, same place, same time, and have a great weekend, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you, Sasha. I wish you a happy weekend too, and looking forward to next week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.